For 20 years, the CIA paid people to spy on America's enemies without ever leaving a room in California. No satellites, no bugs, no agents on the ground, just their minds. They called it remote viewing. And in 1974, one of these psychic spies described the interior of a secret Soviet nuclear facility so accurately that it made a physicist say he would never have believed it if he hadn't seen it himself. The CIA's own declassified documents confirmed this happened. Project Stargate wasn't science fiction. It was a $20 million bet that consciousness could do something science says is impossible. And what they found in those 2 decades might be far stranger than whether or not it worked. Our story begins in 1970 when a book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain hit American bookstores. The authors claimed Soviet scientists were weaponizing psychic abilities: telepathy, remote viewing, mind control. The book described experiments where Soviet researchers killed baby rabbits on a submarine deep underwater and recorded the exact moment the mother rabbit's brain reacted on shore miles away. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. The CIA couldn't afford to assume it wasn't. By 1972, they were funding their own experiments at Stanford Research Institute in California. That's when Ingo Swann walked in. Swann was a New York artist, a Scientologist, and someone who claimed he could leave his body at will. The researchers at Stanford, physicist Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, wanted to test him. They brought him to a physics lab where a magnetometer set in an underground vault surrounded by multiple layers of shielding designed to block every form of interference known to science. They asked Swann if he could affect the magnetic field inside using only his mind. He said he'd try. For several seconds, the output from the magnetometer was changed in ways that had no physical explanation. When they asked him to stop, it stopped. Then Swann did something even stranger. He drew a detailed schematic of the magnetometer's interior, a complex piece of equipment he'd never seen, buried underground where he couldn't possibly observe it. The drawing was accurate. 2 weeks later, men from the CIA showed up at Stanford with Puthoff's report in their hands. They had one question: could this be weaponized? The CIA approved a program called SCANATE, short for scanning by coordinate. The concept was simple but profound. Give a psychic nothing but geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude, and see if they could describe what was at that location. No photographs, no maps, no context, just numbers. Swann became their first operational viewer. In controlled experiments, he described locations he'd never been to with enough accuracy that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Buildings, landscapes, weather conditions, things he had no normal way of knowing. But the program needed more than one person. They needed someone who could prove this worked in the real world against actual intelligence targets. That's when they found Pat Price. Price was a former police commissioner from Burbank, California, but that's not why the CIA wanted him. Price claimed he'd been using remote viewing his entire life to solve crimes. He'd sit in his office, close his eyes, and somehow see where suspects were hiding or where evidence was buried. The Stanford researchers tested him the same way they tested Swann. They gave him coordinates, nothing else. In 1974, they handed Price the coordinates for a suspected Soviet research facility in the Ural Mountains. The site was heavily classified. American intelligence knew something was there, but it had limited information about what was happening inside. Price sat down, closed his eyes, and began describing what he saw. He drew diagrams, multi-story buildings, unusual cranes on railroad tracks, a massive spherical structure housed underground. He described the facility's purpose, materials being researched, even specific details about the building's interior layout. Months later, satellite photography confirmed parts of Price's description. When those images were eventually declassified, physicist Hal Puthoff said he never would have believed remote viewing was real if he hadn't witnessed Price's session himself. The details Price provided matched the facility's actual structure. But here's what makes this case even more unsettling. Some of the things that Price described, interior details that satellites couldn't photograph, were later confirmed by human intelligence sources who actually entered the facility. He'd seen things he shouldn't have been able to see. The program expanded. Through the 70s and 80s, it operated under different names: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, finally, Stargate. Multiple military and intelligence agencies used remote viewers for operational intelligence. They targeted terrorist locations, searched for hostages, tried to locate missing aircraft and downed pilots. The viewers worked in stark, isolated rooms. No windows, no distractions, just a chair, a desk, and coordinates they knew nothing about. But the most compelling case might not even be about espionage. In 1973, before Project Stargate officially began, Ingo Swann did something that should have been scientifically impossible. Hal Puthoff asked him to remote view the planet Jupiter. This was months before NASA's Pioneer 10 probe would fly past the planet and send back the first close-up images. Swann described what he saw. He mentioned something unexpected, a ring around Jupiter. When he said it, the researchers thought he'd made a mistake. Saturn has rings, Jupiter doesn't. Everyone knew that. Except when Pioneer 10 sent back its data in December 1973, scientists discovered something no one had predicted. Jupiter has a ring system. It's faint, made of dust particles invisible from Earth, with the telescopes available at that time, but it's there. Swann had described it months before NASA's probe confirmed it existed. Now, you might be thinking, if this worked, if they really could spy on Soviet facilities and predict discoveries about Jupiter, why did the program shut down? Well, the official story is that the CIA commissioned an outside review in 1995. A researcher named Ray Hyman concluded that while some results were intriguing, remote viewing hadn't provided actionable intelligence reliable enough to justify continued funding. The program was declassified and terminated. That's the public explanation. But one of the program participants would later say something very different. He claimed the program didn't end because it failed. It ended because of what they found, or more accurately, what found them. As I like to say, here's where the story gets strange in a different way. There was a man named Don Elkins, a physics professor who became involved in consciousness research during the same era as Project Stargate. Elkins wasn't officially part of the CIA program, but he was experimenting with similar techniques, trying to access information through altered states of consciousness. According to those who knew him, Elkins claimed he made contact during these sessions, not with distant locations or hidden facilities, with something else, an entity he called Ra. Elkins believed he was channeling a godlike intelligence from another dimension. He documented these sessions extensively, filling notebooks with material he said came from this being. And then, after years of this work, Elkins suffered a mental breakdown. He took his own life in 1984. Whether there is any connection between his channeling experiences and that, we can't know. But it raises an uncomfortable question. If remote viewing is real, if consciousness can actually access information beyond normal sensory perception, what else might be out there in that space? Some of the Stargate participants hinted at similar experiences, not all of them, but enough that it's worth noting. They described moments during deep viewing sessions where they felt they weren't alone, where the information they were accessing seemed to come from somewhere or something else that had its own awareness. The official reports don't mention this. You won't find it in any of the declassified documents, but the whispers were there. Now, here's what makes all of this even more interesting. One of the people who analyzed Project Stargate later suggested that remote viewing was never really about psychic gifts at all. It was a screening tool. What the programs actually stumbled upon was something called claircognizance, the ability to access information without a sensory pathway or imagery. Remote viewing worked because it limited the mind enough to allow that function to emerge. By removing imagination, what's left is cognition functioning independently of normal input. The value wasn't in the fact that someone could hit a target. The value was in identifying those who could access information without imagery, emotion, or inference. It was filtering for a rare neurological configuration, the same configuration found in people with strong intuitive thinking patterns. Most people fail at remote viewing, not because psychic abilities don't exist, but because their brains can't separate knowing from perceiving. If that's true, if this is actually a neurological function that some people naturally possess, then we're not talking about supernatural powers. We're talking about a human capability that science hasn't fully mapped yet. A function of consciousness that exists in the gap between what we can measure and what we can experience. And maybe that's the real reason these programs were classified for so long. Not because they failed, but because they suggested that human consciousness is far less limited than we've been taught to believe. The CIA spent $20 million over 2 decades trying to answer one question. Can the mind access information it has no physical way of knowing? According to their own declassified documents, the answer appears to be yes, at least sometimes, under specific conditions with specific people. Pat Price described a Soviet nuclear facility that he'd never seen. Ingo Swann described rings around Jupiter before NASA confirmed they existed. These things happened. They're documented. But the bigger question isn't whether it worked. The bigger question is what it means. If consciousness can perceive things beyond the reach of our 5 senses, if some people can naturally access information that exists outside normal space and time, then what else are we capable of that we've simply forgotten how to do? What did we lose when we started believing that physical reality is all there is? Project Stargate ended in 1995, officially. But the implications of what they discovered are still unfolding. Because if they were right, even a fraction of what those remote viewers did was real, then we've been living in a fundamentally incomplete understanding of what human beings are capable of. And maybe that's the most unsettling discovery of all. Not that psychic abilities might exist, but that we might have them all along, and we just stopped believing we could. But that's just what I think. I really do want to know what you think. So drop a comment below, please. If you like what we're doing here, like, share, and subscribe. It's free for you. It really does help the channel grow. Be sure to check out all the other links below. And remember, always keep an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.
Or is this the dream?